Thanks. Actually, Aryeh is going to give a brief lead-in. Aryeh.
Dan and I will be exploring the roles played by classical music and jazz in articulating notions of Israeli identity. And speaking grossly, but not altogether incorrectly, Dan will explore how Israeli classical composers attempted to create a space for Jewish particularity within the Western tradition of classical music, while I will explore how Israeli jazz musicians mine Eastern Jewish culture for the idiomatic particulars that jazz then extends, elaborates, and refines. And we'll both use musical examples from YouTube to illustrate our ideas. So now I turn the floor over to the maestro, Dan. Take it away.
I'll just reiterate, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So we're presenting essentially a two-pronged approach to Israeli music, classical jazz. Just for all of you, I brought some CDs at the end. If anybody still listens to CDs. Anybody listen to CDs? Raise your hand. Good, good, cool. You're not just all streamers. You're not just, I have to tell you, I visited University of Florida recently and met with a colleague. He said, I have to tell you, I met with a young student who was 18 years old, and I said, please go to the library and listen to these CDs. And the student said to him, what's a CD? Okay, so it's a different time. Anyway, let's start with just a little background about classical music in the land that was to become and is the State of Israel. Just some about institutional ideas. The first conservatory was started in 1910. So dealing with obviously classical music. Concerts and opera began in the 20s. So this is 30 years before the state itself. The Palestine Symphony Orchestra was begun in 1927. And then the Palestine Orchestra, the forerunner of what's now the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra, one of the most well-regarded orchestras in the country, was founded by Bronislaw Huberman in 1936, the same year that national broadcasting began through the Jewish communities. New orchestras were founded in the 40s and 50s, and classical music in Israeli society became pretty widespread at the time of the beginning of the State of Israel. Choral singing also became a staple in the Israeli cultural scene. The classical music scene itself was enriched drastically with the arrival of over 1 million Russian Jews from either the USSR or then what became the separate, the Confederation of States between 1989 and then 2006. So really not that long ago. The earliest composers in the, quote, classical realm, many who had emigrated from the West, worked to create a synthesis of East and West. Now, although as Aryeh and I talked about this recently, he said it was in fact a romanticized notion, as familiarity of the music of the East was really pretty spotty at best. These creators of music in the 40s and 50s are perhaps best understood through the music of the most well-known of them, a composer named Paul Ben-Chaim. So my talk will be related to specific composers, bringing us from the time of about the creation of the state up until present time. Ben-Chaim was born on the 5th of July in 1897 in Munich, Germany, and died in Israel on the 14th of January 1984. His given name was Paul Frankenberger. During the course of his development as a young professional musician, he served as conductor at the Augsburg Opera in Germany from 1924 to 1931. And after that, he devoted himself pretty much entirely to teaching and to writing music. Ben-Chaim emigrated to the then British Mandate of Palestine in 1933 and lived in Tel Aviv near Dizengoff Square. Dizengoff Square is kind of the center of the cultural milieu of Israel, even back then and then continuing even now. He taught at the Shulamit Conservatory, an early music institution. He Hebraicized his name Ben-Chaim, which means, of course, son of life, becoming an Israeli citizen upon the nation's independence in 1948. He composed lots of chamber music, so for small groups of instruments, works for choir, orchestra, solo instruments, and songs. He championed a specifically Jewish national music, as I referred to before. His own compositions are in a somewhat late romantic vein with Middle Eastern overtones. Sounds reasonable given his background and then his further life. Between 1926 and his immigration to Palestine, he wrote a number of choral as well as solo psalm settings and motets on biblical texts, including Isaiah, Ecclesiastes, and Job. I hadn't thought of it until now, but somewhat following in the footsteps of a well-known composer named Handel, who you might know of, a contemporary, of course, of Bach. And like Handel and Bach, all of his works were in German. But notwithstanding rather snide remarks by one of his biographers or a commentator on a biographer, he was already concerned, it seems to me, with using Jewish texts and their Jewish contents to express himself and his understanding of what it means to be a Jew. Other Judaically inspired works were to come, but mostly after he made Aliyah to Israel, or Palestine at the time. Ben Chaim's association with Bracha Tzfira, who lived from 1910 to 90, the famous Yemenite Jewish folk singer, who had a seminal impact on Israel's cultural life, had a strong influence on his own musical language. She came from did I already say, Yemenite family, so as we spoke about the Mizrahi influence already coming into play with Ben Chaim's music. He arranged many of the songs that she introduced to him, and he quoted from them in some of his orchestral works. The stylistic imprint of her Yemenite and Bukharian, Persian, Arabic, Ladino, and other Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, North African, and Near Eastern Jewish repertoires is apparent in his oeuvre, especially as it reflects characteristic modalities, so the kinds of pitches that would be used, ornamentation, that would be an ornamentation, embellishments, as opposed to and other linguistic patterns and motives. I'm going to Santa Fe tomorrow to see some opera. Among the ones I might see is Janufa by Janáček. And we talk about how Janáček took the language that he used and created particular musical commonalities from the language itself, tried to be very specific, as opposed to what German might sound like, or English, or Hebrew, or Arabic. So we're going to hear a little bit of the third movement of Symphony No. 1, which is written in 1945. And we'll play about 5 minutes of it. So we're going to go to the next slide. And in a minute, you'll just press on it. So remember, this is classical music. So we're going to put on our classical listening ears, which means we're looking for a narrative. We're not looking for repetition as we find in most popular music or dance music that we're associated, but listening to an ongoing progression of a journey. So what I tell everybody, how many are classical music aficionados in the room? Wow, not too many of you. Okay. So here are a few clues, a few suggestions. One, close your eyes, okay? Block out any other sensory input, as it were. Ask yourself very basic questions. What am I hearing? Is something now new or a continuation of what I've heard before? Simple things are also, do I hear a change in, quote, orchestration or timbre, from strings to woodwinds to brass, etc.? What kind of emotional impetus is contained in the music? Is it sorrowful? Is it elegiac? Is it kind of pondering? I'm walking around looking at the parking structure outside, wondering, how did they make that? Or is it somewhat upbeat? Am I really, in fact, happy about being alive and encountering the world? I'll let you decide what this is about, and you can tell me after you hear it. So let's press on it. We should get at the start. Another character is intruding in the music. Maybe some questioning comments on our general boisterousness? Now we're back to our opening place, aren't we, in some respects? Let's see where it goes now. Very different motive quality than we had before, more pensive, wouldn't you say? So that's the third movement from Ben Chaim's First Symphony, but a couple more after that, that become even more perhaps connected, quote, to the area, to the land, but the ornamentation is typically Mizrahi, typically Middle Eastern. The scale, yom pom pim pom. It's called the Phrygian scale. Not to get too technical, but nice that you hear that. If somebody says, hey, do you know any scales? You could say, yes, I know of a Phrygian scale. It ends with that descent going, yom pom pim pom, which is called a minor second above the tonic. The tonic is the note that's sort of central, home base, as it were, to the piece. So he uses that rather liberally, which is part of Jewish prayer music and even a lot of some Jewish folk music. So influenced again by where he was. Is it predominantly, I suppose, in a European mode? Does it have this aura of being a European symphony? Yes, it does. It does. That's his background, that's his upbringing, trying now to bring in these new threads into his new place in new music. Now, Aryeh and I are going to differ somewhat in our presentations also because Aryeh deals with words and deals with larger concepts. I'm a composer, right? I'm looking at Ben Chaim and saying, here's a guy who ends up in a particular place, his background is such, he's living such, what kind of music might he write, right? In other words, it's a very personal experience. I don't sit down at my desk when I write music and say, how much am I Jewish? And how much am I American? How much am I in my 60s? How much am I heterosexual today? You see what I mean? The music is simply part of my being of who I am. So it's of less concern to those questions are of less concern to a composer who simply, quite frankly, is trying like hell to put notes on the page at any one time or another and build a piece out of it, build a piece of musical logic and beauty, right? So that's what I'm giving you in these presentations of these composers, is individual composers whose circumstances are such that they may end up representing for somebody who wishes to theorize about this something larger in a context in which to place it. They might even talk about their music in that manner. At the end of the day, it's largely about the individual's response trying to make music, right? These are background issues that are important, but again, you have to be thinking of these as individual composers as well. So the second generation composers, most of them direct and indirect students of the first, that's no surprise. They worked towards a musical expression which integrates the Hebrew language. Remember, Hebrew language is now becoming the lingua franca in Israel, with its consonants and intonation, Jewish liturgy and tradition, and the developing Israeli identity. A fine example of this is Andrei Hajdu, Hajdu. Yeah, let's just go to that so we can. Good. He was an immigrant from Hungary, born in March of 1932, and who died just a few years ago in August 2016. So again, when we think of this, the expanse of Israeli history, he's there from before, beginning, and now into 60 or 70 years later. He studied klezmer, Klezmer, for those of you who are typing, a Jewish folk music of Eastern European origin. And he also studied Hasidic repertoires, the Hasidic movement being kind of an evangelical movement, to make a comparison that makes it clear, of the 16th and 17th century, founded in Eastern Europe, where we also find klezmer music. He was deeply involved in Jewish topics, not only on the usual folkloristic or liturgical levels, but also more abstract subjects of Jewish thought, like the oral law that goes along with the written law of the Torah and the Bible, philosophical books, as well as Jewish history. This is to say that Jewish religious life, thought, and practice were central to his being and his music. We're going to listen to the fourth movement from his Jewish Rhapsody. It's called Dance and Prayer. dance and prayer. So it will take some of that rhythmic motion that we had in Ben Chaim's music. You can imagine somebody moving like this to that music. And then prayer, right? The majestic, unknowable qualities that we use, that is suggested or is found in prayer. So here we go. This recording is not quite as clean as the other, but you'll just have to deal with it. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. It's about 7 minutes long. 7 minutes long. Call that long, low-held note a drone, characteristic of music of the Middle East. Tune. It's like a folk tune that comes in there, isn't it? It involves a solo clarinet, by the way. Here it is. The strings are becoming percussion. Klezmer influence. What is happening, right? it's terrible to be in Aryeh's position. He's coming after me, and I've got to make sure need to leave him enough time. Well, you can stop. We can stop it. Yeah. So go and listen. It's right on YouTube, and listen to that movement. It's the fourth movement. There's probably another 3 minutes. I'm sorry to stop, but you heard that we went from clearly boisterous dancing, then exhaustion, to some sort of soulful individual prayer, right? That's what we're hearing in that music. He brings back that drone. Yes?
I'm a Balkan music aficionado.
Yeah.
And I loved the first half of it. You saw a lot of Balkan influence.
Sure.
And then it switched.
Yes.
And you didn't see them anymore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, remember, Jews that lived in diaspora in all sorts of places, so we absorb all sorts of things that come into our musical lexicon. Okay, the third generation of composers, we've had first, second, third, manifest a desire to participate in international composition, but within their Israeli/Jewish national sensibility. To grapple with the Holocaust as an essential background feature of present Israeli Jewish life, and to continue to merge Eastern and Western traditions. It's where they are. Betty Olivero was born in Tel Aviv on the 16th of May in 1954. She's just a year younger than I. She studied music at the Rubin Academy at the Tel Aviv University. She studied piano and composition. She then came to this country and studied with my teachers at the Yale School of Music, Jacob Druckmann, and a fellow named Gilbert Ami, a Frenchman. She uses melodies and modes from her Sephardic, Mizrahi Jewish background, building layers of overtones and pantonal harmonies on top of them, which to say it's not going to sound quite as solid as some of the straight tonal music would. So the effect is at the same time contemporary yet clearly familiar. Her music has a distinctly Sephardic and tonal character about it, while combining the extended tonal and non-tonal worlds of modernism, as found in the music of her mentors Jacob Druckmann, who I mentioned, and Luciano Berio, one of the most famous Italian composers of the latter half of the 20th century. Her music is both airy and atmospheric, and earthy, often in alternation as she moves between these two worlds of, quote, modernism and Jewish historical consciousness. So we're going to listen to her piece, which is called Achot Ketana, based on a 13th century Sephardic prayer and quoting from a Bach Chacon. This lasts about 6 minutes. I may have to cut it as well. I always think I'm not going to have enough material, and I always have too much. Anybody else have that problem? Yeah, okay, you all do. And you worry, right, that you're not going to have anything to say for the last 5 minutes? Okay, so here we go. We're going to hear a bit of this. We'll see. I might play all of this and just, Aryeh, you're going to forgive me, and then I'll shorten up Yitzhak Yedid.
Can you spell her name?
Yes, Betty, B-E-T-T-Y. That's pretty clear. Olivero, O-L-I-V-E-R-O.
Thank you.
Oh, you have a blackboard. How old-fashioned. Olivero. Good, I like better markers.
Is like little sisters?
Oh, the Achot. Aryeh Achot? Yeah. Is Aryeh still there?
What's the question again?
Achot Ketana is little sister.
My little sister.
Yeah, my little sister. So that's what I thought. Okay, here we go. Sorry, yes. Is it not playing?
Oh, wait, because I'm sorry.
There we go. Can you start? Let's start it one more time. Here we go. We're going to start at the beginning. Close your eyes. This is very dreamlike. Imagine an atmospheric dream of different colored smokes almost. Wispy. Moving in and out of dream states. Found the end of a sentence, and now we move to the next sentence. Another big breath. You should feel some frisson between the worlds that she's juxtaposing. One is sort of a looking back, and then perhaps the problematic nature of the present world. Okay, that's Betty Olivero. Our last composer is Yitzhak Yedid. Yedid. I'm going to make this a little briefer. So he was born in 1971. So much younger composer. He now lives in Australia. His family is of Jewish, Syrian, and Iraqi descent. He says his initial experiences were formed going to a synagogue that was in the Syrian prayer mode. So that were the sounds that he imbibed. He studied in Israel at the Reuben Academy, then at the New England Conservatory, where he studied in the third stream area. Third stream are those guys trying to push together jazz and classical music. So it's a wonderful lead-in for Aryeh. In 2012, he got his PhD from Monash University in Melbourne. His music incorporates a wide spectrum of contemporary and ancient styles, he says, and is an integration of improvisation, Arabic genres, and contemporary Western classical music. We're just going to hear a couple of minutes of a piece called Kiddushim and Kilulim, Blessings and Curses. If we can, here we go. We'll just do a couple of minutes. I'll let you explore this on your own more later. In this piece, there are many different kinds of gestures. So my question, same or different, is appropriate here. When does it change and to what? Repetition of musical modules. Somewhat chaotic in nature, huh? A nice little Middle Eastern tune. Oh, and there are the glisses, in case you had any question, right? That ornamentation. Excellent. So go listen to this piece on your own, Kiddushim and Kilulim. I'll get these notes into your box so you can find it. And there you have it, a brief and concise snapshot of Israeli classical music from its origins to now. Thank you. Aryeh, it's yours.
Okay, so again, thank you very much, Dan, and it's my pleasure to be here. It's a bit strange always in these situations. I'm looking at this little eye in my computer. In my peripheral vision, I know there's people here. Hello, everybody. Okay, but I will, there's Dan. How you doing, Dan? And then, okay, so we're good to go. I'll begin with a story. And I'm going to, this is a small amount of time for really, if we're talking about jazz, culture, Israel, a huge subject. So I'm going to save the prefaces. Along the way, I'll try to fill in any gaps. But I'm just going to dive in with a story, which is when the American jazz great Lionel Hampton walked into a cocktail bar next to Tel Aviv's Dan Hotel in 1955, the local Israeli house band serenaded him with a rendition of his hit Flying Home. And after they finished playing, the musicians approached Hampton to get his take on their style. The jazz master replied, Y'all don't swing for shit. Now, by the way, everyone can hear me pretty well? Okay. You can say a little less than 60 years later, the Israelis are swinging pretty well. As Jazz Times trumpeted in 2008, when it comes to jazz, Israel is the source of an almost miraculous outpouring of talent. From the dynamic bassists Avishai Cohen and Omar Avital, to the three horn-playing Cohens, Avishai, Anat, and Yuval, to the saxophone colossus Eli Djibri, and many others, Israelis stand with others in the front line of the international jazz scene. Indeed, Tel Aviv has become an internationally recognized breeding ground for serious jazz talent. According to Larry Monroe, Vice President for Academic Affairs at Boston's Berklee College of Music, if I had 3 days to find 10 really hot jazz musicians, I'd go to Tel Aviv before any other place on the planet. Now, this is all quite remarkable when one considers just how irrelevant jazz was in Israel not so long ago, when, as Lionel Hampton put it, Israelis didn't know how to, well, swing. So how did Israel become a jazz nation, as it were? And is there such a thing as Israeli jazz, or is it really just Israelis playing jazz music? So my brief lecture today will be composed of 2 parts. In the first part, I'll offer a brief history of how jazz became a part of the Israeli landscape, and then I'll discuss the emergence of an Israeli sound. Now, I don't throw around the term sound lightly. As Ben Ratliff wrote in his biography on John Coltrane, sound is used by jazz musicians as a mystical term of art. Every musician finally needs a sound, a full and sensible embodiment of his artistic personality. And what's true of individual musicians is true too on a broader level for a culture. It has its own sound. So what is the sound of Israeli jazz? So a brief history of Israeli jazz. After the founding of the state, by the way, if anyone has any questions along the way, just I guess raising your hand won't help because I might not see you, but just let me know, okay? Okay. So after the founding of the state in 1948, the overwhelming majority of jazz musicians in Israel, and there weren't many, were foreign born. If you wanted to hear jazz, you listened to Radio Ramallah, broadcast from Jordan. Now, to be fair, what was true for jazz was also true for rock and roll, because for the country's first few decades, Israel Radio was a state-run institution dedicated to educating citizens in the ways of a collectivist ethos. Personal sacrifice was celebrated. Refrigerators, luxury items, and they were taxed. Jazz was considered to be frivolous. It was also a matter of cultural orientation. There was a Russian musical heritage, the influence of the French chanson, and which was much greater than the American influence, and more. But stubborn individualists who nevertheless wanted to hear jazz during the 1950s headed out on Friday afternoons to the Zionist Organization of America House in the heart of Tel Aviv, because jazz is, after all, a 20th century American invention. Not surprisingly, it was an American transplant, Mel Keller, who led the sessions at the ZOA House. Now, in the early 60s, Keller founded Israel's first full-time jazz outfit, and he staged performances around the country, during which he would periodically stop to explain the music to the audience. Danny Gottfried, a native Israeli, fell in love with the music and linked up with Keller, and in time, he would found the jazz faculty at the Jerusalem Rubin Academy of Music, the Jazz Studies Department at Talmud Yalin High School, and the yearly Red Sea Jazz Festival in the southern town of Eilat, which is today a very big international jazz festival. So jazz started showing up in Israeli clubs in the latter half of the 1960s when Israeli society as a whole became more open. Television was first introduced in the country in 1968. And the first jazz records were made at the end of the decade. Then in the early 70s, jazz musicians around the world started to mine non-Western musical traditions for material and inspiration. This was connected also to a crisis within the world of jazz, beyond the scope of this discussion. But Israeli jazz artists began exploring how to integrate elements of Mizrahi music, Mizrahi referring to Israeli culture from Arab and Muslim lands, and jazz. So for instance, the first Israeli jazz, ethno-jazz disc was recorded in 1972, Albert Piamenta's Mizarei Yisrael yikabtzenu. He who scouted Israel will gather them. The title being a verse from the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah being one of the major prophets of the Bible. And Stan Getz, an American jazz star, also arrived in Israel and collaborated with two other Piamenta brothers. At this point, let's listen to 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes of Stan Getz and his early mid-1970s jazz collaboration in Israel. I'll say at the outset that these efforts didn't really gain any traction to a certain degree because of the relatively marginal place that Mizrahi culture then occupied in Israeli society. But it did sort of presage, it did give a first hearing of what was going to become the Israeli sound. And it's an interesting sound. Again, mid-1970s. So what you're going to have is a kind of fusion world music where it's electrified, it's an electric sound. Today, Israeli jazz is much more acoustic, with electric instruments, including an electric guitar, and an integration of some distinctly Arab or Jewish Arab musical elements. So this is Stan Getz in Israel playing with the Piamenta brothers, a song called Mitzvah Goreret Mitzvah, a commandment lead, or the performance of a commandment leads to the performance of another commandment. It's a title from traditional Jewish culture that was made into a song. The video quality isn't so good, but we'll work with it. All right. Israel's first international jazz festival took place in 1979, 2 years after Israel's Labor Party fell from power. And during the 1980s, jazz stars such as Chick Corea, Bobby McFerrin, John McLaughlin, and others started appearing on the Israeli scene. Now, it's interesting that as Israel started to privatize its economy and personal freedom emerged as a value alongside, not in place of, alongside of dedication to the collective, jazz received official recognition and institutional support. A number of academies were opened up in 1985, and they entered into a fruitful collaboration with the Berklee College of Music. But all of this is, in a sense, the prehistory of Israeli jazz. The music took off in the early 1990s when a critical mass of jazz musicians and educators produced a homegrown generation that needed more than what Israel could offer. Israeli jazz literally took off on a prosaic day in 1992 when 20-something jazz musicians Omer Avital, Avishai Cohen, and Avi Leibovich flew to New York City with the intention of making it in the Big Apple. Barak Weiss, the artistic director of the Tel Aviv Jazz Festival and the Israel International Showcase, refers to that trip as the Big Bang, the moment Israeli jazz as we know it was created. Now, the Israelis arrived in New York City armed with a strong work ethic, a fiercely creative spirit, and a deeply ingrained sense of community. This is a rare combination. And after an initial struggle, Cohen was soon touring with Chick Corea, while Avital was setting the Smalls Jazz Club on fire and featured in the New York Times and offered a record deal with the Impulse label. Leibovich found himself playing with Slide Hampton at Lincoln Center. So with Cohen, Avital, and Leibovich paving the way, a whole new Israeli jazz generation, such as soprano sax player Daniel Zamir, Anat Cohen, Anat's brother Avishai. There are two Israeli jazz musicians named Avishai Cohen, Eli Dubry, and others soon followed. And just like that, the Israelis created a thriving jazz community in New York. And the mutual support didn't go unnoticed. American trumpeter Ambrose Akinmusori noted admiringly, a lot of people in New York have this everyone for themselves attitude, and I think it's beautiful that they stick together. But Israelis weren't only going to America. The cross-Atlantic musical traffic became a two-way street in 1997 when Arnie Lawrence, a Brooklyn-born alto saxophonist and co-founder of the jazz program at New York City's New School, moved to Israel with his Israeli wife and opened up an international center for creative music in the outskirts of Jerusalem. It's also no accident that Lawrence found a home for his school during this period, as Israel was racing to link itself to the global economy and culture. The first Israeli branch of McDonald's opened up when? 1993. 1994, cable television arrived, and Israel signed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians. These all go together. The openness that increasingly animated Israeli society was reflected in its music. Mizrahi music, a fusion of Middle Eastern styles and Western elements, had become mainstream Israeli pop in the 1990s. And Israeli jazz musicians started integrating various musical elements, many from Jewish culture with deep roots in Arab and Islamic ruled countries, into their music and ultimately their sound. I'll say one footnote. One thing that you should refrain from doing is calling the countries from Morocco to Iraq Arab countries. Know that there's this thing called the Arab League, and people call them Arab countries, but there's a plurality of identities from Morocco to Iraq, from the Amazigh, North Africa, to the Copts, to the Kurds, to the Jews, to the Arabs. So it's not an Arab world, it's a plural world with an Arab majority as a whole. In any case, in order to understand the emergence of the Israeli sound and what it says about the character of Israeli culture, we need to understand an important aspect of jazz. Now, as the great American novelist, poet, critic, and philosopher of the blues and jazz, Albert Murray, has written, jazz was based from its inception upon an integration of imported musical forms with vernacular and idiomatic particulars. In the American case, the fundamental part of the American vernacular was the blues. Y'all know what the blues is, right? I don't have to explain this? Okay. What's interesting is that in the case of Israel, the blues is part of what's imported. So the question becomes, what in the Israeli context is idiomatic? What's the vernacular? Now, this is an important question from the perspective of both Israeli society and jazz. From the perspective of jazz music, it cuts to the question if all we have is Israelis playing American jazz or the emergence of Israel's own sound. From the perspective of Israeli society, it cuts to the question that's at the heart of the cultural dimension of the Zionist project. Because when the Jewish people began to regather in the land of Israel in the late 19th century, The idiomatic dimension is exactly what was missing. Think for a moment of the fate of the Hebrew language. In the exile, Hebrew had retreated to the exclusive realm of high culture. It was used for philosophy, theology, prayer, and poetry, but you couldn't buy a glass of milk in the market speaking Hebrew. The rebirth of Hebrew in the 20th century was the rebirth of Hebrew as a spoken vernacular language. It was never a dead language. It had become a high language, right? It was never a dead language. It became a spoken everyday language, and the vernacular had to be recreated. Now, to make a long and complicated story short, and this really is a long and complicated story, the initial attempt at cultural rejuvenation nullified, skipped over 2,000 years of exilic history, and attempted to plug back into the cultural channels that were in biblical sources. Now, again, when you're talking about the Bible from an Israeli perspective, put aside Sunday school, put aside church, or if you're coming from a secular perspective, put aside the exclusive religious notion, the Bible is, for Israelis, our national history. So it's plugging back into the sources of a national history. The main point for present purposes, and I'm again oversimplifying, is that in general, diasporic cultures were relatively marginalized. Cultures of the diaspora were relatively marginalized. However, when the masses of Jews from Arab and Islamic ruled countries immigrated in the 1950s and 60s, in many cases, though not all, they managed to maintain a continuity of historical memory that cut against the grain of this dominant ethos. And to return to our story, Israeli jazz musicians have increasingly mined Jewish traditions from the Arab and Islamic world that were maintained in Israeli society for the idiomatic particulars that then became the basis of their jazz. What I just said, is that clear? Jazz musicians have mined the Jewish traditions from an Arab and Islamic cultural contexts that were maintained in Israeli society. These became the idiomatic particulars that became the basis of Israeli jazz. For instance, the pianist Omri Moore says something very interesting in the liner notes to his disc, It's About Time. We're not going to have time to listen to Omri Moore, but we'll have a couple more musical examples. But he says, after listening to the North African musical styles that he learned growing up in Jerusalem, he says, I began experimenting with the music and found that when integrating the powerful melodies of the music that I grew up on with the harmonies that I was familiar with as a jazz musician, the result was nothing short of magical. In improvising over these melodies, I always strive to maintain the authenticity of the musical modes that I'm playing while simultaneously playing over the changes. That is, improvising over a given harmonic progression, which is the most common way of playing jazz. So it's not simply a story of making musical sense. In many ways, creating Israeli jazz goes hand in hand with rediscovering or recovering or embracing dimensions of personal identity. Take the case of Itamar Baruchov. He's a star Israeli trumpet player, band leader, and composer. He's born into a musical family with roots in Central Asia. He was raised in the mixed Jewish, Christian, Muslim city of Yafo on the Mediterranean coast. He grew up in a musical home with Edith Piaf, Weather Report, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, and Prince playing on the turntable. So he already had a musically open mind when he stepped outside and he breathed in the multicultural air of Israel, especially the Moroccan Jewish and Yemenite Jewish sounds that set the tone for much of modern Israeli music. And when he entered the neighborhood Sephardi synagogue, think of a cultural nature reserve that preserves centuries-old, still living Jewish traditions originally produced in an Arab Islamic cultural milieu. When he went to these synagogues, he absorbed sacred music based upon Arabic maqamat, scales that featured quarter tones. Now, surrounded by diverse musical options, Baruchov set his sights on becoming a jazz musician at the age of 12. In 2007, at the age of 23, he relocated to the States. He studied under a number of jazz greats, and here's the crucial part of our story. He received a wake-up call one day when, as a participant in Betty Carter's Jazz Ahead program in Washington, D.C., hard bop icon Nathan Davis said to him, "We need you to be you." Davis's words enabled Borokhov to understand that, as he says in the liner notes to his second disc of Boomerang, in full disclosure, I wrote those liner notes, but as he says in the liner notes, quote, I have to be real. If Coltrane was informed by his grandfather being a preacher, I had to do the same thing. Lee Morgan's from Philly. I'm from Yafo. He brought gospel. I'm bringing Sephardi synagogue music. To be clear, Sephardi synagogue music in this context stands for all of the influences that Borokhov absorbed growing up in a Bukharan Jewish family, then ethnically diverse town, literal synagogue music among them. So here's one case. Itamar's jazz version of an Algerian piyut. A piyut is liturgical soul music from the synagogue, and also not the synagogue, but his jazz version of an Algerian piyut called Adon Olam, literally master of the universe, which is a hymn of praise with which many congregations still today begin the morning service. So if you could please play Itamar Borokhov, and we'll listen for the first couple of minutes. Okay, great. Interesting here is not only the discovery that the roots of Israel's idiomatic particulars extend to the history of the diaspora, even as they blossom and flower in modern Israel. It's also interesting to consider that jazz, from its inception, was a musical hybrid. And by integrating jazz form and ethnic music, quote unquote, it can be argued that Borokhov and Israeli jazz musicians like him are extending the jazz tradition out of the resources of the tradition itself. At the turn of the 20th century, Jelly Roll Morton was also talking about the Latin tinge. In the 1940s, Dizzy Gillespie was making Afro-Cuban music. In the 1960s, Horace Silver got in touch with his Cape Verdean roots in Song for My Father, and so on. And as Borokhov notes, quote, bebop was integrated, tribal, sophisticated, and down-home soulful. What I'm doing now, bringing my sound to the jazz idiom isn't different from what Dizzy Gillespie did. I'm progressing by reconnecting to the roots and taking it to the now and to the future. So before concluding, I'd like to cite one more musical example of the idiomatic particulars of Mizrahi culture that have animated the sound of Israeli jazz. Borokhov's integration of Sephardi synagogue music in the broad sense into his sound was aided by musical collaborations with Omer Avital, one of the original members of the early 1990s Big Bang, had received the same command to be you. He got it in a different way. In Avital's case, when he came into contact with the jazz tradition, and it's a tradition. A lot of it's still oral. You got to sit with the masters. You hear the stories. It's visceral and alive. And when he came into the contact with the jazz tradition, it moved him to wonder about his own traditions. In this case, the Moroccan and Yemenite traditions from his father's and mother's sides, respectively. So Avital's integration of Moroccan and Yemenite particulars found expression in various musical projects in which Borokhov participated. Debka Fantasia, Yemen Blues, and what we'll turn to now, the New Jerusalem Orchestra's Ahavat Olamim, Eternal Love. It's a unique big band, arrayed on stage in a crescent, with a 17-piece orchestra featuring, a wide selection of instruments ranging from a cello, viola, and violin to two ouds, a three-part brass section, a Turkish ney, and three kinds of Arabic drums, with the 20-person choral group behind. Center stage in this performance that we're going to see is the great singer and performer of Moroccan piyut, again, liturgical soul music, Rabbi Chaim Luke, with the orchestra led by Avital on bass behind him. Now, Avital, what he did is he took apart, recast, and extended the Andalusian originals. The idiomatic particulars for this music is Andalusian Jewish music. But Andalusian is also much more than just Jewish. It's Berber, Amazigh, Arab, Spanish, Sub-Saharan African. All these parts make up something very vital. We'll listen to a piece called Tzoshahiani. It's a piece that was adapted by Rabbi David Buzaglo, a legendary 20th century master of Moroccan piyut, who passed away in 1975. He adapted it from an Arab Andalusian song, Ali Hayani, composed by Muhammad Foute. Tzoshahiani is based upon a Berber rhythm, an Amazigh rhythm, and uses an African pentatonic mode. That means it's 5 notes. And this makes for a natural connection to the blues. The scale is made up of 5 notes. It's too much for now to get into the musicological side of it. But it has a natural connection to the blues, which is also pentatonic. Now, the orchestra included one African-American musician, Greg Tardy, who came over to Israel for the performance, good friend of Omar Avital's. And what Avital did is he drew out the blues feeling by having Greg Tardy belt out a gritty solo, rich in an American Southern feeling, with an American Southern feeling that sounds remarkably natural in this Andalusian context. So if we can please play the last video and start at 4 minutes, and then I'll conclude. that's a good place to stop. Good. I wish I could play the whole thing. We don't have time. All right. So, in conclusion, in the liner notes to the New Jerusalem Orchestra's album, Ahavat Olamim, Eternal Love, Avital and his partner made a programmatic statement. They said, we seek to ingather the exiles of the Jewish soul that were exiled in of all places, the land of Israel. So why is he saying that the exiles of the Jewish soul were exiled in the land of Israel? Because, and again, to speak broadly, grossly, simplistically, initially, cultures with roots in the diaspora were marginalized. Befittingly, let's think back, that statement connects us back to the title of that first 1972 album, the first ethno-jazz album made in 1972, which was called He Who Scattered Israel Will Gather Them. So Israeli jazz is, in a sense, the sound of the ingathering. But not only that, the idiomatic particulars of Israeli jazz, the particulars that give Israeli jazz its distinctive sound, and yes, what we have here is not simply Israelis playing jazz, but the sound of Israeli jazz. This distinctive sound that propels the music to the front of the global stage, these idiomatic particulars were found in Jewish culture from an Arab and Islamic cultural context. So the sound of Israeli jazz helps us to remember something that is often forgotten or elided when Israel is discussed in various forums, which is the story of Israel is an internal Middle Eastern story. The story of Israel is an internal Middle Eastern story that's engaged in a dialogue with the West, America included. And you hear that in jazz. Israeli jazz, the sound of that story extended and elaborated in the conditions of the modern state of Israel. Thank you.